The Turn to Intersubjectivity in American Psychoanalysis, Chapter 3. Part 2. Intersubjectivity in Relational Psychoanalysis. Aaron and Benjamin. Many analysts from the relational movement have moved from interpersonal theory to develop models of intersubjective psychoanalysis. The psychologists Aaron, Benjamin, Davies, Ehrenberg, Ghent, Hoffman, and Stern are among the most frequently cited. For purposes of this chapter, I focus on two influential authors whose work raises several crucial issues for analytic therapists, and which I find most compatible with my own perspective. Jessica Benjamin, professor at the New School for Social Research in New York and the postgraduate program in psychoanalysis at New York University, and Lewis Aaron, professor of clinical psychology and also a teacher at the postdoctoral program. As they are collaborators who regularly cite each other's work in numerous publications, I discuss their contributions together, although I refer to individual papers. In her important book, The Bonds of Love, Benjamin, 1988, relied heavily on the tradition of European philosophy, including her own elaboration of the parable of the master and slave in Hegel's philosophy of the spirit. Her philosophical background and her reading of French feminists reflect a sociological and anthropological inspiration, influenced by her training at the Frankfurt School. In The Bonds of Love, she attributes the term intersubjectivity to Habermas, who used the phrase intersubjectivity of mutual understanding. She notes that this expression was adopted by the pioneering infant researcher, Colin Trevarthen, to describe the baby's communication of its intentions to the mother and their reciprocal proto-conversations. For Benjamin, 1990, 1995, 1999, 2004, 2010, intersubjectivity refers both to a capacity of the infant that can be directly observed and a theoretical concept that challenges models of mental functioning confined to the intrapsychic. Her debt to the infant developmental research of Trevarthen, M. Beebe, and STEM shows clearly throughout her writing, similar to many contributors to the relational movement. Freudian concepts based on analyses of adults involve the substantially different dynamics of intrapsychic processes and constitute a separate field of inquiry for Benjamin. Although she emphasizes the effects of interactions between subject and preference to intrapsychic conflicts, she admits that this theory, in which the individual subject is no longer supreme, must confront the difficulty for each subject in recognizing the other as a center of experience equal to itself. Benjamin, 1995, page 28. Benjamin redefines the traditional concept of object relations to describe an ongoing interaction between two subjects, rather than representations of objects within the mind of one person or between a subject and another person taken as object. Like Stolorow, she presents a straightforward definition of psychoanalytic intersubjectivity as the field where two different subjective worlds intersect. Ibid, page 29. Of course, this statement can convey a simple tautology without specifying the implications of the terms field and subjective worlds, which cover a set of extremely diverse notions. A field can mean simply an area of study, a locus of social negotiation, or a metaphor from physics or computer science, suggesting well-defined numerical parameters. Civitarese and Farrow, 2013. Benjamin's conception of the third, discussed below, reflects her emphasis on the intersection, the joint construction of an experience by both analyst and patient to which each participant brings a personal history, sometimes involving an intermixing or blurring of psychic boundaries. The sharing aspect seems central to her position. Aaron's articles 1991, 1992, 1997, 1999 present a nuanced conception of analytical work divided between attention paid to the development of a singular subject, in which the analyst's focus remains closer to a traditional intrapsychic model, and that devoted to intersubjectivity, following a relational model. In the latter, the analyst hears every association as a communication, interpretation, or attempt to influence him, rather than simply as evidence of psychic processes. Aaron stresses that each analysis is mutual. Like the analyst, the patient constantly tries to understand the intentions and desires of his interlocutor and to communicate their effects as he experiences them. Although he acknowledges that there are times when an analyst must be silent to devote his listening to the solitary work of his patient, who seeks to reconstruct, for example, early life experiences, in general the analyst is implicated in these efforts. Moreover, the force of enlightenment and transformation in the cure depends largely on the analyst's ability to put himself in question. He must always consider the possibility that the patient's transference behaviors may be a response to his own unconscious messages, conveyed in words and effects. Here, one can infer the influence of Ferenczi's attention to the effect of the analyst's behavior on patients. He warned how the analyst can unwittingly repeat a trauma in relational theories. Aaron, 1992, has developed this connection in several papers, which argue that transference can be addressed within the here and now of clinical interaction, not simply viewed as a repetition of the past. Point 4 from the principle of transference reciprocity as a mutual entanglement. Aaron moves inevitably to consider the advantages and problems arising from the analyst's disclosures of his own thoughts and feelings. He warns that if the analytic situation is indeed mutual, a claim to neutrality by the analyst or a pretense of non-involvement in the transference can have the violent effect of non-recognition and disavowal. But if he intervenes by revealing his thoughts to the analysand, showing his cards, what guarantees that he does not inflict as much violence? In general, relational psychoanalysts appear sympathetic to self-disclosure, but its practice varies widely among practitioners. For Aaron, 1991, revealing the analyst's subjectivity at a basic level of interaction is an inevitable occurrence in every therapy, if often unwitting and unconscious. Intentional communications, however, must be tempered by an ethic of respect for the otherness of the patient and recognition of the risks of intentional intrusion into his private world. Therapists who employ self-disclosure should be wary of falling into a form of hidden suggestion or authoritarian pressure because of the transferential asymmetry of the analytic relationship. After all, as Ferenczi learned in his experiments with mutual analysis, the mutuality extends only so far. As much as analysts reject the traditional expert role, they cannot easily avoid being placed in the position of knowledgeable authority in the patient's transference. While analytic therapists themselves may undergo significant psychological changes as a consequence of clinical interactions, the process remains inherently unequal and asymmetrical. Aaron suggests circumstances in which the analyst may usefully express her own ideas or admit some of her feelings, but these are circumstances that do not relate to charged autobiographical material. He proposes self-disclosure of the analyst as a means of opening up a patient's awareness of the intersubjective dimension by permitting him to compare his new experience in analysis with former relationships. At the same time, Aaron repeatedly modulates this emphasis on analytical revelation, acknowledging that an analyst cannot claim to know himself well enough to confirm or refute the truth of his self-disclosures, nor to validate his understanding of his participation in transference reactions. To deal with this key problem and to prevent an overheating of the dual relationship in the transference, Aaron, 2006, and Benjamin, 2004, find recourse in the concept of the third and have collaborated on how varieties of a third position function in clinical practice. Many theorists from Lacan to Ogden have employed the notion of a third position or a triangulation of the subject-to-subject encounter to avoid a blind entanglement in a transference configuration. Lacan, 1953, advanced the concept of the paternal metaphor, the nom du père, a pun on the no or the name of the father, as introducing a third element into the process of subjectivation. The symbolic name of the father opens a level beyond the mother-infant dyad that inscribes the nascent subject in the family system and culture. Benjamin rejects Lacan's structural conception of the paternal metaphor, which he apparently views as requiring the presence of an actual father. Aaron, 2006, page 357. Ogden reformulates the analytic third as an intersubjective creation, noting that at the same time the analyst and analysand qua analyst and analysand are created by the analytic third, there is no analyst, no analysand, and no analysis in the absence of a third. 1994, page 16. The analyst's access to a third position represents a step beyond the interpersonal or relational, providing the means to escape from a Hegelian clash of selves over power and dominance, or the dead end of rigid complementarity. Benjamin has added different forms of the analytic third, summarized in Aaron, 2006. In the type she calls 1 1/3, a specific rhythm belonging to each pair represents the third, like a quasi-musical unit composed by the couple over the course of an analysis. This form of third, similar to Ogden's, constitutes a shared construction unique to each therapy that an analyst can come to as a counterpoint to her individual role responsiveness and private fantasies. In the second type, the third in the one, Benjamin describes a decentering of the analyst that enables her to gain another perspective on her countertransference, moving away from the lived experience of the therapy to take the independent viewpoint of something learned in training or supervision. One might say that there are many thirds in the one, many subjectivities in each person. Aaron also mentions an intentional third to create a space for differentiation. 2006, page 356. According to Aaron, 2006, access to a third enables an analyst to interpret the transference-countertransference complementarity by directly acknowledging his oscillation between positions. From a third position, he can tell the patient how he sees himself responding and link the similarity of this behavior to a former object relationship. The tendency to slip into a dyadic mirroring, usefully redefined as complementarity by Benjamin, 1999, becomes a huge problem looming over any relational treatment anchored in the here and now 0.5 ln, the Lacanian model. Analytic process should open from a constricted imaginary dyad of projected fantasies onto a symbolic triadic space, where the unconscious appears in the spontaneous flow of speech. Aaron, 2006, describes several examples of an analyst finding another perspective on his participation in a transference within his own mind, the third, in the one model. This way of gaining self-awareness is not always made explicit in discussions of technique. To feel trapped or even unable to think clearly in a specific interaction, to search for ways to escape a recurring dynamic configuration during a therapeutic hour, to entertain simultaneously multiple theoretical models, or to be reminded of the words of former supervisors represent familiar aspects of clinical experience. But ultimately, do these concepts of a third represent something other than an attempt to deal with an increasing enmeshment in the intersubjective transference process by attempting to construe what is transpiring? As Jacobs, 1993-1999, 6 writes, unconscious communication largely exceeds the interpersonal and conscious awareness of both participants, rendering the aim of analytic mastery of countertransference unachievable. The use of the concept of a third by relational analysts constitutes a strong attempt to escape entanglement in a complementary dyad, but may itself become a resistance to the therapeutic process by lending itself to conscious rationalization or to a preferred theoretical formulation. While undoubtedly useful in situations of impasse and paralysis, I employ the concept in chapters 6 and 8. The phenomenology of an imagined or remembered third does not succeed in resolving the inherent intersubjective problem of sustaining presence without imposition. Access to a concept of the third may help the analyst dissentere from a repetitive complementary role response or a prolonged enactment, but calls for further deconstruction. Aaron makes the important point. I do not think of the third as describing a kind of analytic space that exists free of enactment. 2006, page 362. Benjamin may be best known for her work on intersubjective recognition. Intersubjective theory, she writes, postulates that the other must be recognized as another subject in order for the self to fully experience his or her subjectivity in the other's presence. This means, first, that we have a need for recognition, and second, that we have a capacity to recognize others in return mutual recognition. Benjamin, 1990, page 34. Like Stolorow, she builds on concepts from phenomenology, but differs in her dual attention to the interpsychic and the intersubjective domains. She employs Winnicott's distinction between subjective and objective objects, as well as Mahler's ideas about separation and rapprochement to support her point about the differentiation and separateness of subjects. Her formulation returns us to the Hegelian dilemma of an encounter between two subjects, reminiscent of Model's earlier analysis, in which the other can affirm but also negate. Recognition of another subject may feel immediate and unmediated in some circumstances, but in adults at least, perhaps even with infants, it vies with private wishes and faces the Sartrean sting from the encounter with otherness. Ibid, 1990, page 43. The reason I brought Hegel into this scenario was certainly not because I wanted to conflate the persons who come to psychotherapy with Hegel's self-consciousness, but because there is an inherent challenge for human beings in depending for love, recognition, and care on others they cannot control. Benjamin, 2010, page 251. Benjamin elaborates her position on mutuality and difference in a debate with Orange, who criticizes her for endorsing an unequal power relationship and insisting on the patient's recognition of the analyst. To see another person as a separate and equivalent center of being can be so relieving, Benjamin responds, 2010, page 249. I find it hard to identify with Orange's descriptions. Although she denies imposing reciprocity on the patient, Benjamin's commitment to the existential value of recognition seems inherently to involve the goal of mutuality and sharing in the therapeutic relation. I fully endorse the importance of recognition in intersubjective theory as I develop in Chapter 8. Nonetheless, what we mean by this highly abstract concept remains subject to numerous interpretations. From an ethical, social, philosophical standpoint, acknowledgement of the other as a human being like ourselves, a separate and equivalent center of being, is a fundamental principle. Recognition like this remains problematic or non-existent in the political or societal sphere, especially in authoritarian countries where relations of power and domination predominate or when racial, ethnic, sexual, and other stigmas are highlighted. Benjamin, 2011, brings her analytic perspective to these situations in her work on witnessing and collective trauma. In the psychotherapy situation in which many values and assumptions are shared, I suspect that basic existential recognition, as indicated by acceptance of personal boundaries, the professional setup, and common courtesies are more typical, although survivors of personal trauma will often test this frame. Benjamin also refers to recognition of fundamental needs and feelings, 2005, page 447, and of others' intentions, page 448, both of which raise problems of objectification of a subject struggling to contain complex and ambivalent attitudes. However mutual the socially structured therapeutic role may be, the analytic situation encourages a patient to use his analyst for transference, and by implication, to treat him as an object to control or manipulate for defensive or libidinal purposes. The analyst role requires active management of such tendencies when they emerge and receptivity to their content, especially when repugnant to him. The deepening of psychotherapy typically reveals the otherness of a patient's values, tastes, and choices, which challenge an analyst's non-judgmental acceptance, and usually stimulate countertransferential resistances that need to be worked through. Lacan pointed to this impediment to analytic process, designating respect for the alterity of subjects and their idiosyncratic desires as a basic ethical objective of training. Bearing a patient's mistaken or accurate perceptions of one's way of life, sexual habits, moral values and beliefs, and eschewing needs for affirmation or affection from him belong to this ethical obligation. But while the end of treatment may bring a decrease in idealization or devaluation and a more realistic perception of a therapist as an ordinary human being, should clinicians strive for attaining mutuality. Aaron makes it clear that mutuality does not imply symmetry or equality. 1997, page 893. Like Benjamin, 2010, he may be thinking about the primary intersubjectivity of the parent-child relationship, which is unequal and asymmetric. However, translating from the limited mutuality that characterizes early development to more complex symbolic relationships suggests a category mistake. The kind of personal recognition that subjects seek in intimate relationships like psychoanalysis operates at a different level from seeing the other as an equal partner. Analytic listening and responsiveness can generate a feeling in some patients of being recognized as a byproduct of a positive interaction and idealization, but the substance of the recognition remains vague. Who or what is recognized and by what figure? Does a reification of the self reappear in this guise? The effective signs of recognition convey sameness and mutual mirroring, which may tilt in the direction of an unproductive narcissistic affirmation of an image for both analyst and patient, a kind of collusion in an imaginary harmony. Dialogic speech, progressing beyond the equivocal and ambiguous utterances, smiles, and stereotypicums and AHS of therapeutic interaction, inevitably disappoints the subject's narcissistic longing for recognition. The analyst says not enough or not quite what a patient expects, or too much. At such moments, the framework of responsive listening and basic recognition of the other may be temporarily disrupted and in need of repair. A stress on mutuality may be a differentiating feature of relational theories and a useful counterpoint to the authoritarian position they reject in classical models. When presented as an intention of the therapist, however, significant problems arise. Wilson has explored the neglected issue of the analyst desire, seldom mentioned in discussions of the mutuality of recognition. He observes, the analyst cannot help but have desires and want them recognized by the analysand. 2003, page 71. The problem for Wilson lies in an over-immersion in the dyadic relationship, which stimulates imaginary fantasies and promotes a lack of differentiation. Lacan's 1959-60 Seminar on Ethics placed the successfully treated analyst beyond the temptation of desiring any gratification from the patient, but spoke of an impossible desire for recognition as a motor for the transference. I find his confidence in the analyzed clinician's immunity to imaginary desires unrealistic and even counter-therapeutic. Lacan himself frequently insisted on the importance of the analyst having, but not acting on, strong feelings about his patient. But this acknowledgement calls for more than restraint. The analyst wishes, as Wilson argues, may inflect the therapeutic relationship in many ways. The non-talking cure. In this section, I focus on a tendency in contemporary psychoanalysis to privilege implicit, non-verbal interactions over the traditional speaking relationship. As noted, many authors cite infant research as evidence for a relational approach. Trevarthen's influential concept of primary intersubjectivity drew attention to the intentional interactions of early childhood, which reflect inborn capacities and demonstrate how early exchanges between mother and infant are charged with meaning and operate in reciprocity. Certainly, when we observe a baby playing with its mother, we see all the signs of good attunement or derailing, mutuality or conflict that are aspects of any adult relationship. Moreover, attachment research shows that some relational elements remain consistent from childhood to maturity. From this evidence, it takes only a step to reconceptualize psychoanalysis so that the talking cure with its emphasis on speech and dialogue cedes place to a nonverbal dynamic. The Boston Change Process Study Group 2007 calls this nonverbal aspect of relationships an implicit relational knowing, which they applied to therapeutic interactions, a position modified in subsequent papers by an appreciation of the verbal dimension. Yet, as noted above, taking the problematic step of transposing the parent-infant relationship onto the analyst-patient relationship raises serious questions about technique. This analogy has been explicit in the publications of many relational analysts and self-psychologists, in whose writings the model of primary intersubjectivity as a pre-symbolic interaction sometimes eclipses subsequent developmental steps toward a complex, triangular intersubjectivity. Moreover, infant-mother interactions are not simply examples of innate biological mechanisms, but involve a semiotic process organized by language. Language itself does not arise spontaneously from an inherited universal grammar, but requires maternal proto-dialogues. The child relies at first on index and iconic signs, which signify the mother's responsive presence, before acquiring the capacity for verbal communication. Concurrently, as Muller, 1996, argues in his groundbreaking integration of Trevarthen and Aitken's research, 2001, with Lacanian semiotics, the maternal language organizes the entire interactional field, providing an intense training in the use of symbols. 7 Lacan observed that before the learning of language, the semiotic field maps the mother's function, which represents the human world. Muller, 1996, page 113. In the process of subjectivation, the child learns a code that structures, often retrospectively, as in the après-coup, his position as a speaking subject. Meanwhile, the mother's experience is mediated, constructed by her history, desires, and fears, much as Benjamin suggests, so that pre-verbal attunement and implicit knowing between her and her child does not by its early appearance in life necessarily bypass cognitive and affective semantic processes. An additional problem with applying infant studies to intersubjectivity in older subjects concerns the question, attunement with whom? Who is the subject of this implicit harmony? Of course, therapists encounter experiences like the moments of meeting the Boston Change Process Study Group, 2007, evocatively describe. But can that feeling of resonance or sense of recognition be equated with the earliest inscribed, pre-symbolic patterns of attachment, almost ethologic in quality? The assumption that attunement takes place in the present, rather than evoking a fantasy of a lost object, for example, reinforces this omission of history, as if it describes a kind of mirroring of the phenomenological self. Stern, 2002. The feeling of mutual recognition seems likely to arise from the expression of iconic signs that produce an experience of sameness or oneness, as Muller has proposed. If the analogy between baby and patient can be traced to roots in the genetic metapsychology of Freud through the concept of early fixation, it remains that Winnicott presented this model directly by treating the clinical setup as a scene of explicit regression. In clinical cases reported by Winnicott, the sequential modalities of object use as a subjective object, a part of the self, or as a real objective object, become central to the process of subjectivation. A baby begins to draw the boundary of a self separate from others as he recognizes his mother's survival as an independent subject despite his ruthless, aggressive fantasies. Winnicott, 1969. For Winnicott initially, and many writers since, psychopathology grows principally out of early maternal failures like non-responsiveness or impingement that can be identified through the transference. Some patients alert their therapist to the problem by saying that they don't feel seen, perhaps a kind of helpful supervision if accepted. Nonetheless, a formulation of impairment derived from identifying the point of interrupted development appears, for better or worse, to belong to the classic, reconstructive model. Formulations from the standpoint of developmental theory, rather than from an intersubjective stance, violate Stolorow's criteria by importing extra-analytic knowledge, and can reinforce a complementary dyad in which the analyst takes a third-person, subject-to-object, view that defines the patient. The analyst then becomes an observer, rather than a participant. Can intersubjective theory ever be compatible with the reconstruction of early events and the objectifying position necessary to this task? When the analyst views his patient essentially as a baby, their relationship must be affected, even if he does not attempt directly to repair early deficits in mothering. Such was Green's critique of analysis modeled on the maternal provision. H. Surely, the infantile appears only in its present-day derivatives, highly influenced by later motivations, identifications, and life experiences that are woven into the fabric of the subject. In attempting to speak to the residues of the transformed infantile, a therapist must navigate between the pitfalls of re-traumatization and seduction to avoid imposition of his own psychic reality on his patient. After all, a growing awareness of the unreliability of interpretations and their source in countertransference and theoretical affiliation was what brought about the reorientation toward an intersubjective approach. A combined approach of interpersonal and intersubjective models presents the crucial problem for analysts of how to use the past as reported, inferred, or reconstructed intersubjectively. Analysts attempt to solve it in different ways. The varied applications of the term intersubjectivity by different clinicians is the theme of Beebe et al.'s 2005 book Forms of Intersubjectivity in Infant Research and the Treatment of Adults. Beebe, an analyst of the Institute for the Psychoanalytic Study of Intersubjectivity, is frequently cited for her studies of face-to-face play between mother and child, where she has used video recordings to perform microanalyses of their interactions. She concludes that each relational partner influences or adapts itself to the other in an implicit and unconscious manner. She comments that those who rely on observations from infant research like the Boston Group, and those whose concept of intersubjectivity derives mainly from psychoanalyses of adults, like analysts influenced by Bion or the logic of phenomenologic models, Stolorow, take different perspectives. The book describes a few. For this reason, she and her colleagues propose that intersubjectivity be replaced by forms of intersubjectivity, which they categorize according to the theory of dynamic systems. In all its forms, illustrated in their book through the help of a simple pictorial diagram, the adjective intersubjective is applied to a variety of conceptions of what is going on in the interaction of two minds, a dyadic system throughout life. The particular version Beebe's group favors emphasizes reciprocity and equivalence of influence between the two partners, familiar to studies of infants and mothers. In the psychoanalysis of adults, they acknowledge each subject brings its prior expectations and its ways of engaging with the other, which inevitably influence the emerging dynamic system of the couple. They hypothesize that the verbal and symbolic relationship rests on a pre-verbal base, the two levels representing a simultaneous adaptation of the system. Beebe illustrates her model by the case of Dolores, a patient extremely sensitive to her perception of the facial expressions of the other. To protect herself against a repetition of early relationship trauma, Dolores withdrew as a child from all intimate ties, while her professional life and ability to maintain distant, friendly relations remained more or less intact. The report of her analysis indicates that the corrective experience of treatment enabled her to acquire a new form of relating. According to the neuroscientifically oriented commentator, R. Pally, the psychic change in Dolores was affected at a procedural level, i.e. non-representational and implicit. She adds that in psychoanalysis, an emotional and nonverbal exchange can play as important a role as a verbal interpretation. In Beebe et al., 2005, page 199. Pally's position, like the early claims of the Boston Group, is consistent with Trevarthen's original model of primary intersubjectivity, which does not depend on unconscious wishes and fantasies or the symbolic structures of language. Instead, the substance of the intersubjective exchange resides in the music of attunement analogous to an ethological level that can be observed in social animals. Studies of groups of monkeys demonstrate the major effects of the mother-child relationship on the future of the offspring consistent with this viewpoint, which amounts to a naturalized view of human intersubjectivity as already part of endowment at birth. Clinical case studies like BB's that take this standpoint on implicit reciprocity come close to leaving the impression that language and all the baggage of human culture have been grafted onto a set of behaviors genetically programmed to regulate the functioning of primate societies. In the 1970s, the American anthropologist Birdwhistle 1970 first used video recordings to show that therapists participate in a kind of dance with their patients, seemingly in search of mutually compatible physical positions, although without knowing it. His studies on the science of kinesthetics stressed that the social personality is a space-time system involving movement and rhythm. Roughly only a third of the content of a therapeutic conversation is transmitted through words, he concluded, while the bulk is negotiated through kinesics. Using similar video techniques, infant researchers like Beebe perform microanalyses of interactions between babies and mothers, and the Boston child analyst Alexandra Harrison, 2005, studies moments of change in the psychotherapy of her young patients. A video analysis of a session with a 7-year-old boy reveals the onset of very rapid symmetrical movements between Harrison and her patient that preceded, and perhaps, paved the way for her verbal intervention after a long silent period of apparent non-relatedness between them. Their implicit or procedural interaction anticipated a shift toward mutuality before it became part of her conscious awareness. Pally, B.B. al. 2005, reminds us that neuroscience confirms the registration of experiences by unconscious pathways that are inaccessible to reflection, recalling the work on mirror neurons. In his research, STEM 2002, found indications that pre-symbolic systems evolve independently of the psychic organization of the symbolic system. STEM and the Boston Change Process Study Group, 2007, argue that the healing process of analysis may be more accurately explained by the effect of nonverbal communications on the implicit, procedural operations of the patient, rather than by explicit interventions. Like Pally, they conclude that the actions of the analyst can lead to changes in behaviors of patients that rely on procedural memory, without any explicit interpretation being made. Along with this widespread interest in the implicit, one finds a mistrust of metapsychological theories and an attempt to found an intersubjective clinical practice on the basis of scientific data. Here, where neuroscience and infant research join in constructing biological models of intersubjectivity, a hybrid form of naturalization of the subject appears. The mother-infant dialogue and its physiologic basis in the brain, empathy, mirror neurons, procedural learning, as natural product of evolution, then replace the radical psychoanalytic notion of the unique emergence of the subject as an effect of symbolic meanings and transformations. We might ask whether the notion of independent operations of two brain systems, one nonverbal and inborn, the other a symbolic structure, matches the reality of the organization of the brain/psyche. One might equally assume that reciprocity between levels of processing experience occurs consistently throughout the development of the child, making it impossible to assign a behavior to a particular system. As the neuroscientist Park and Achino's 2015 observe, we adapt to our environment through personal, contextualized learning, not through impersonal mechanisms of attunement. The form of attachment, for example, becomes inextricably entangled over time with the sexual, with the child's interpretation of parental messages, with the influence of family structures pervading the culture, and with the internalization of important signifiers that accompany the child's development from before birth. The infant's immersion in semiotic exchanges does not require its linguistic competence to shape the subjectivation process. As Vivona 2006 has observed, noting the tendency to emphasize nonverbal aspects of the therapeutic process, language is not simply a set of abstract symbols, but is deeply rooted in the body, an observation also made by Lacan. Understanding that we are born into language, concludes Litowitz 2011, refocuses our attention on the ways that specific features mediate our relationships with others and with the world, re-establishing an intrapsychic dimension to the concept of relationship. Freud wrote that the human subject was both a function of transmitted culture and language, carrying the history of the chain of generations, and biological imperatives, pursuing survival and reproduction. In a later piece, Vivona, 2009, recalls that the frequent reference to the research of Rizzolatti and Galeese on mirror neurons to support the importance of implicit communications, in the countertransference, for example, leaps quickly from empirical results of diverse experiments to applying them to the much different work of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis has historically possessed the particularity of highlighting the dimension of meaning, the semiotic network on which all human societies depend. The analyst's evident nonverbal participation in the negotiation of a shared space does not change the fact that the entire treatment exists within a language world that makes us speaking subjects, not simply interacting animals. Conclusions. This condensed summary indicates the complex evolution of the concept of intersubjectivity in American psychoanalysis. The term was adopted and used by psychoanalysts beginning in the 1960s to fill gaps in a theory that did not seem to take full account of the impact of the analyst on the process of treatment and to support relational approaches to patients. The confused and confusing debate between one-person and two-person psychologies derives from this distinction. During this same time period, the search for scientific support for psychoanalysis turned to infant research and, soon after, to the neurosciences, both of which were used to support an intersubjective perspective. In terms of its current use, I have tried to trace two major currents in this complex field. One, typified by Stem and Stolorow, has been more antagonistic to traditional psychoanalytic theory, while the other, represented by Aaron and Benjamin, attempts to work in continuity with its historical concepts. Across all schools, the intersubjective paradigm has led analysts to recognize the impact of their own activity, including personal style, gestures, language, and effects, in the unfolding of the analytical process. The analyst is engaged in an intersubjective construction of his experience that extends well beyond his conscious control. I have criticized interpretations of this construction that privilege non-symbolic, implicit interactions or biological mechanisms, like mirror systems. Analysis remains a talking cure based on semiotic exchanges that carry meaning, shaped by language and culture, discussed in Chapter 8, and involving the individual subjectivities of each participant. How to create a new model of psychoanalysis that encompasses all these elements challenges and enlivens contemporary practice. Notes. 1. Freud's comments about the effects of one unconscious on another, beginning in his 1912 paper, Recommendations to Physicians Practicing Psychoanalysis SE 12, 109-120, have been interpreted in different ways. For some, this type of communication is fundamental to intersubjective relations, Brown, 2011, but there are other ways to interpret Freud's observations, see Girardin, 2002. 2. Here, the influence of the postmodern is clear. From Lyotard's grand narratives to the principles of Freudian psychoanalysis, systems of explanation proved inadequate to address the specificities of human lives. 3. The American Psychoanalytic Association had been granted unique status as a regional intermediary between local societies and the International Association in the 1940s, but the growth of independent societies in the United States, many subsequently recognized by the IPA, began to present alternatives to its hegemony. Changes within the societies belonging to the American also forced a re-evaluation of standards for analytic practice, leading up to the rewriting of organizational policies and its hierarchical structure. 4. Levinson, 1994, has been a strong proponent of the view that the important dynamic issues are always present in the current interaction. 5. Sandler had earlier developed the idea of role responsiveness by the analyst as a part of the analytic relationship. 6. Jacobs was criticized for his presentation at the IPA Congress in Amsterdam in 1997 for building an interpretation from the fantasies and memories that accompanied the session. He gave the erroneous impression of aiming to reduce psychoanalytic formulation to the evidence of his countertransference. Jacobs, 1993-1999. 7. Goldberg, 2016, has reviewed the experimental evidence for language acquisition, which in her analysis refutes the Chomskyan concept of a universal grammar. When Chomsky's theory was first presented, she writes, "We did not realize how massively repetitive the input was, nor could we appreciate how closely children's initial productions reflect their input." p. 8. The fascinating debate between Stem and Green addresses the philosophical, scientific, and clinical issues posed by infant research for psychoanalysis, Green and Stem, 2000. Green takes a polarizing position, rejecting Stem's arguments for the relevance of the data as departing from basic assumptions of analytic theory.